Hello and welcome to our panel on climate action through community-focused philanthropy. Instead of talking about these people, I'm going to let them tell about themselves. So Mustafa, do you want to start off by introducing yourself to our audience and a little bit about the organization you're representing today?
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. I've been working on environmental justice issues social justice issues since I was 16. I helped to found the Office of Environmental Justice at EPA. And now I am the Executive Vice President of the National Wildlife Federation. The National Wildlife Federation, as the name says, we are very focused on protecting wildlife, natural spaces, and making sure that folks have the ability to be able to enjoy those things. So it's an honor and a blessing to be with you.
Carol?
So my name's Dr. Carol O'Donnell, and I'm from the Smithsonian Institution. How many of you have ever been to the Smithsonian? All right, how many of you have ever heard of the Smithsonian? Okay, so the Smithsonian Institution, large institution, 39 organizations. Most of them are museums, 21, 9 research centers, but they also have an education center called the Smithsonian Science Education Center, and I'm the director of that center. We work with youth and educators across the globe to advance innovation, sustainability, and inclusion in STEM education in collaboration with communities across the globe.
Great.
Terrific. I'm Clay Stranger. It's an honor to be here. Great to be on stage with all three of you. I'm a managing director with Rocky Mountain Institute. We are about a 40-year-old nonprofit think and do tank working globally to transform energy systems. And we recognize that energy across sectors is about 70% of the climate challenge, but it also represents about 70%, therefore, of the solution. And our founder, like 40 years ago, I think very early in his days, recognized that the clean energy transition was actually like an overlapping master key that can, of course, address climate issues, but simultaneously address issues around prosperity, security, public health, and biodiversity and others. So that's why we're so focused on energy. We know that many, including colleagues on this stage, are working on parallel and adjacent challenges and super important ones. But we, for our part, have decided to stake our effort and our mission against transforming global energy use.
And I forgot to introduce myself. I was so excited to have you all introduce yourself. So I'm Esther Whieldon. I am a senior writer on the Sustainable One Thought Leadership team. And I think my co-host, Lindsay, is here in the audience of the podcast, ESG Insider, that we're here doing in-person interviews for, in addition to being on moderator of this great panel. And you mentioned how this intersection of social and energy issues, and I think that's something we focus a lot on our podcast as well. But I think today, you know, Mustafa, I want to turn to you first. Can you connect the dots for us between sort of environmental justice and climate change and why it matters, and how philanthropy fits in that picture?
Sure. I think the best way to start is to honor James Baldwin. James Baldwin once said that if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things that you don't see. We often don't see the impacts that are happening in our most vulnerable communities. They are the places that we often drive by and never stop and spend any time. We often don't understand also the connection between what's happening from those disproportionate impacts in our most vulnerable communities and how it's linked to the climate crisis. So let me see if I can do that in 120 seconds.
Okay.
Everybody do me a favor. Everybody take a deep breath. Just hold it for a second. All right, let it out. You know, there are a lot of places across our country where we actually can't do that, in those sacrifice zones, in our most vulnerable communities. Right now, in our country, Harvard had a study a couple of years ago. We've got over 350,000 people who are dying prematurely from the burning of fossil fuels. Those fossil fuels are often located in our most vulnerable communities, in Black and brown communities, indigenous brothers and sisters, and their particular communities, Asian and Pacific Islander communities, and lower wealth white communities. In our country right now, through that air pollution, we have more people who are dying from air pollution than are dying from car crashes. More people are dying from air pollution than are dying from gun violence. And until recently, more people were dying from air pollution than the overdoses of drugs, but we've seen how that has continued to accelerate. Why do I bring that into our conversation? Because that same air pollution that is making Black and brown and lower wealth communities sick and shortening their lives is the same air pollution that is one of the main drivers of the climate crisis. So there is a direct synergy, if you will. There's a direct connection between why we have to be focused on the impacts that are happening in our most vulnerable communities and what's happening in relationship to the climate crisis. The question becomes, in this transformational moment, are we willing to stand up and do the right thing? Philanthropy plays a critical role in that space. We've seen all the resources that the federal government has been moving in relationship to both environmental justice and to the climate crisis and the clean economy that we have to be focused on. But there are still gaps that exist inside of there. And foundations play a role in helping to make sure that we are addressing the gaps, also providing the dollars that are so critical for people to be able to move from surviving to thriving, to be able to take those visions that so many frontline leaders have had for years and have been doing amazing work with tiny amounts of money, transformational work. Now we have the opportunity to make sure that that is expanding. We have the opportunity to create those public-private partnerships and to be able to really, help to move the needle in a very significant way.
Now, a very 101 question for any of you, but feel free to take it as well. What is philanthropy? If I was explaining it to, my friend's 6-year-old son, what would I tell him?
Well, I would say philanthropy are individuals who have the right heart and hopefully have the resources to make sure that we're moving forward in a very positive direction. Philanthropy sometimes is smaller, sometimes it's larger, but it plays a critical role in helping us to not just address the social justice, various issues that are going on, but also to help to make sure that the resources that are so critically necessary are being utilized in a way that helps to move the needle once again. I'm sure the panelists have a deeper...
Yeah, feel free to add on to that if you wish. But Carol, let's turn to you next. Can you talk a little bit about your talk a little bit about your global work, working with children, and as part of that, similar to the question I asked Mustafa, can you explain sort of how science education intersects with climate and addressing environmental justice?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for the question. So how many of you in the audience have ever been to a climate week before in the past? And for those of you who have been there, if you think back years ago, did you ever hear the term Sustainable Development Goals even 5 years ago? So, yeah, and so today, how many of us here or heard the word Sustainable Development Goals this week? Just even one time if you heard it. So over the past, since 2015 when the UN Sustainable Development Goals were put into place, in 2016, the Smithsonian Institution made the decision that we were going to use the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for learning because we needed a common language in which we could educate youth across the globe. So we had always educated youth across different countries, but we never really had a common language for science education. So we extracted from the UN Sustainable Development Goals in January of 2016 what we believed was the science and the social science that we thought students should be able to know and understand and to act against, no matter where they lived in the world. One of those topics is around environmental justice. Another one is around clean energy. Others, clean water, climate action, climate change, climate resilience, biodiversity loss. There's a lot in there that helps young people not only understand science, which is what we've done for decades, right? We've taught students science facts, but today that's not good enough. We have to teach students science facts by using their communities as their laboratories in which they go into their communities and they extract from that community kind of their understanding around that particular issue and how it's impacting them. So if we use environmental justice as an example, I grew up in inner city Pittsburgh in a neighborhood called Hazelwood, which was incredibly socioeconomically challenged. And we had steel mills at the bottom of our street, and I actually thought that's where clouds were made. I didn't realize that was pollution. Wow. And so the Environmental Protection Agency developed a tool called EJ Screen. And EJ Screen helps somebody like me understand if I put my zip code into EJ Screen, and I can now look at what does the pollution look like in my area? Is my area poorer or richer than a neighboring area? Do I have more asthma in my area? Do I have more impacts from pollutants? And so what we do is we draw on the incredible resources of organizations like the National Wildlife Federation, the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the Smithsonian, to help kids understand these issues on a local scale, to act against those issues on a local scale in a way that's meaningful to them and is having a local impact, but to understand that these issues are very global. And so we work in 88 countries right now. We are hoping to expand that effort, and we are hoping to continue, of course, between now and 2030, to use education as a way to achieve this sustainable future.
So give me an idea of how you get it to the students then. Do you collaborate with the schools? Kind of give me a little bit, 30 seconds of the nuts and bolts of how that happens.
Yeah, great question. So first of all, we create guides. They're called community research guides that take a year or 2 years to develop by drawing on all the incredible research that exists, not only from organizations like EPA or National Wildlife Federation, but also from corporations. What are they doing to advance some of these incredible issues? Then we provide professional development to teachers. This is all free. And then we work with the community organizations to personalize it. Because again, no matter where you implement these Smithsonian Science for Global Goals guides, they look different because they're based on local need.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, Clay, you are involved in the carbon-free transportation program. And we know transportation is like, in the US, it used to be the second biggest emitter, but now it's the top one, right? So talk to me about what that program involves.
Yeah, so I wake up every day working with an incredible team of people thinking about how to eliminate oil, air pollution, and carbon from global transportation systems. And it's an amazing challenge. It's like probably the most fun thing I've ever done, despite the challenge. But something both of you hinted at, this idea of maybe a tension between inclusiveness and speed in the transition. And the way that shows up in our transportation work is like obviously huge imperative to wring carbon out of transportation systems as quickly as possible. As Esther mentioned, it's now the largest source of carbon dioxide emissions in the US, by far the fastest growing source in places like India and China, and will soon be the largest. I firmly believe that just decarbonizing the sector isn't enough because of the need for everyone to benefit from the transition. And so our program is built around an initiative called Electric Mobility for All. And the tenets of that program, the first is to extend the benefits and services of electric mobility to the communities who would benefit from it the most, but would be late or last to receive those benefits. And that manifests differently in inner city locations in the United States versus rural India versus sub-Saharan Africa. But the priority of distributing the benefits of low-cost, zero-pollution mobility to populations that would be late or last to receive it first is a very different approach than saying, let's start with the early movers who can afford expensive EVs that they can park and charge in their garages. The second tenet is that we prioritize the vehicle segments that move the majority of humanity. So if you look around the world, that's buses, and that's electric 2- and 3-wheelers. Well, 2- and 3-wheelers very quickly becoming electrified, that do billions of passenger kilometers every single day. And the third thing we do is we target the places like you described, where there's just disproportionate concentrations of public health crises popping up due to the fact that, for example, in the United States, diesel trucks are about 4% of the total vehicle fleet. They contribute to 50% of the respiratory disease. And so if you happen to live by one of the places where diesel trucks stop, idle, or pass by every day, there's just this unfair and completely unjust burden. So focusing on electrification or decarbonization of those sectors first. The idea that we can actually go fast and go together on this one is like what motivates me and keeps me in the game.
It's interesting you mentioned near truck stops, right? I grew up near a truck stop, and you could smell the trucks and the gasoline in the surrounding area. Had never connected the dots on that, but yeah, that's interesting. Let's stick with you, Clay, real quick. Can you talk a little bit about what work you're doing in India? And in particular, you and I were talking before this about how it's also helping address the need for, instead of having to build out infrastructure to get to the smaller communities, there's other solutions to that, which is just fascinating to me.
Yeah, so I mean, in a breath, how we work is that we provide technical assistance and support to decision makers and simultaneously engage communities and beneficiaries to be a voice in the solution design. We are seeing amazing innovation both in India and in sub-Saharan Africa right now in the electric 2- and 3-wheeler space. One of the coolest things I've seen recently is swappable batteries. So imagine that you have an electric 2-wheeler and that you can take it to your place of work or home, pull the battery out, charge it, swap it with a full one. But that is also now getting integrated into home energy systems where the grid hasn't yet reached in rural India and rural Nigeria. And so not only does this one elegant, interoperable battery provide you a way to get to and from school or to and from your job or the market, it also unclips, and the residual charge can power lights so that your children can read and study at night. It can power devices, including cell phones, so that you can be connected to the global community that we're helpful. And then lastly, in some of these rural communities in sub-Saharan Africa and in India, this business model, the design, both of the vehicles and the idea that you can actually, instead of needing to own one, you can lease one on an OpEx basis, so you never have to come up with the several $1,000s you can pay for it by the day, by the hour, by the kilometer. That business model is completely homegrown. It's being built and developed in these communities, and so we're doing what we can to support the faster production of the vehicles, the very affordable financing of them to these small entrepreneurs that then lease them out to their fellow community members.
That sounds great. Carol, you were looking at me. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, it's interesting because I wonder if I could build on this, because
Please do.
imagine someone from the Smithsonian going to someone like Clay, because this is what happens, learns what Clay is doing or draws on EPA or National Wildlife Federation, takes that knowledge and puts it into, we have developed a guide called Sustainable Communities, which is part of the Smithsonian Science for Global Goals Guide. And it gets kids to go into their community and to survey their transportation. Like, how do I get around within my community? What are some of the ways that I'm getting from one place to another? What energy am I using in order to heat my home? So they look at their home spaces as well. And so this is so crucial, because imagine a 5 to 18-year-old being given the opportunity to ask questions about their community that are building on what you're doing and the innovation, but also giving them the knowledge and tools to better understand how they can make decisions within their community to reduce, for example, their carbon footprint based on the choices they're making around transportation.
I love it. Let's do it.
No, knowledge is power, right?
Yes.
And so you're equipping them with a way to look for it, right, where they may not even know to look for it before.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Mustafa, can you talk to us about some examples where you've partnered with communities and companies or others to solve the local challenges you were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, you have to. Frontline leaders, organizations have to be in the decision-making space and should be actually framing out the directions that we move in. We got a number of different examples of how you get that done through our CEC, the Climate Equitable Collaborative, making sure that frontline organizations and leaders are helping to make sure that we're moving forward in the way that the work needs to be done. We've done it. Let me also add, making sure that students are also a part of that process as well. So when you look at the work of the CEC, you first got to ask the question, so who's a part of that? How did it come to be? Many of you may know A.Y. Young, the battery tour that went on last year, so that was a part of the kickoff for the CEC. We work from sort of this paradigm of making sure that environmental justice, making sure that children's health, and making sure that climate education is where we're coming from. What does that look like, on the ground? We actually are doing different events, both with nonprofits and with business and industry and frontline leaders to move the agenda. So for those of you who went to COP27, You had organizations like Dr. Robert Bullard in Texas Southern. You had Dr. Beverly Wright with the Deep South Center. And then, of course, you just heard from the amazing Peggy Shepard and WEAC. So doing the pavilion that was there, bringing forward all these amazing folks who are doing the work on the ground, whether it's around wind or solar or helping people to do the energy efficiency audits that are so critically important. So it is about addressing public health, but it is also about helping people to understand that you have a space and a place in this new clean economy and being able to move forward. It's about working through the SEMI initiative. So everybody saw the CHIPS Act that went out, right? And the huge amount of money that was there. We have to also ask the question, how do young people play a role in that space? How do vulnerable communities play a role in that space? So been working with both the conferences and opportunities inside and outside to make sure that folks are moving forward on climate equity priorities, if you will. Making sure that inside of those organizations, the working groups that are there, bringing forward the key critical areas. But let's go a little bit deeper, if I got a second.
Yeah,
we also do work with the front lines with folks like Reverend Leo Woodbury there in Florence, South Carolina, who just launched this new training center, making sure that folks have these new sets of skills to be able to start their own businesses, and then also taking solar panels and pulling moisture, pulling water out of the atmosphere, if you will, to be able to move forward on the food justice issues that often happen.
For agriculture, like little gardens?
Exactly.
Oh, I love that.
Well, in the South, it's a little bit bigger than the little garden.
Okay, that's fair, that's fair.
So
Big
we
ag
all
down
walked
there.
out. I don't know if you had a chance to walk out here on the roof and to see what folks are doing there. So imagine folks having the opportunity to build that out in a number of different locations. It is about making sure that we're actually doing work with HBCUs as well.
And what does that stand for?
Historically Black colleges and universities. So we got to give a shout out. Watch this. How many folks went to a HBCU in this room? We have one person. All right, so we got to do a little better on making sure getting more folks who are here. But it is about making sure that the students who are there are moving into these sets of opportunities, whether those who are going to move into, the things that are happening with SEMI, or the things that are happening around outdoors in the various sets of job opportunities that are there, but also making sure the folks who come from the land have an opportunity to protect the land. We have a laundry list of things that we're actually doing on the ground and making sure the real people's voices are being a driver. But let me just share one last thing. I know we got to move on to the other folks, is that our organizations, whether we're coming from the corporate space or we're coming from the nonprofit space or coming from the philanthropic space, we got to make sure that representation is actually playing out in a real way. It is on our boards. It is also on the people that we are hiring at the senior levels, but also the folks who are walking in the door. And that's why the work that we do is so important, because you can't have a 21st century organization if it doesn't look like America, or if you're coming from a broader global scape, from the country that you're representing. And we've been pushing to make sure, like we have an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, to make sure that all the steps that we're doing, that they're in alignment with what frontline leaders are asking for, and that we are moving forward in a way that we don't do any additional damage, and hopefully we do a bunch of good. So I just thought it was important for us to share that, because in many instances, we come up with what we think are great ideas, but those may not be in alignment with what frontline communities are asking for.
Yeah, and I think that fits into a question I wanted to ask you. I think that's part of the answer, which is, I don't know who all our audience is entirely, but I imagine some of them are people who are entering the sustainability space, and then there's people like me who have been in it a while. For anyone who's thinking of going into like community-based philanthropy, like 3 bullet points of things just to not muss it up, like lessons learned and how to really make sure that what you're implementing is both sustainable and valuable to the community.
Sure. So I've worked in over 1,000 communities across our country and some outside of our country. First thing is lessons that my mother and my grandmother taught me. Listen. So what does that mean? You actually got to spend time with folks and hear what they are sharing. without coming with your own preconceived sets of notions about that community or about what that community needs or even about the direction that we have to go. That ties into the second thing, understanding the power dynamics. There are treasures that folks bring forward. We were talking a little bit about this backstage. We often think that those who bring hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars into a space are the ones who have the most power to sort of frame out the directions we're going to have to go into. We have to evolve into a 21st century way of understanding that there are treasures and blessings that everyone brings and be willing to honor that, if that makes sense to everyone. If that makes sense, nod your head like this. I want to make sure. So the majority of people are nodding their head. The third part is to understand that the folks who have been living with the impacts have a right and we have a responsibility to make sure that the sets of opportunities that they are able to fully be able to utilize those. First thing is to listen. Other thing is to make sure there's those opportunities. The third thing is to understand that there are these power dynamics and we've got to be able to work through that, balance it out, thank you, in a positive way. That was not the elevator speech, so I apologize.
No, I think it was great. So there's, in the work that I've done in the podcast and other areas, whenever I hear just transition come up, it really tends to depend on who's talking and the context. And I'm just curious, I'd love to hear from each of you, how do you define, and just transition in general is the concept of as we're going to a low carbon economy, how do we do it in a just equitable way at a very high level? But how does that translate to each of you? What do you think of that as meaning? And let's start on the front, Clay.
Sure. I mean, so I'll interpret the question through the lens of my work in transportation, and it shows up in a couple of different dimensions. It starts with the very real reality that, at least initially and still somewhat, the battery value chain and the electric vehicle value chain has been unjust and unfair, and that there has been child labor, forced labor, and other horrific realities associated with critical minerals for batteries. For me, the just transition ties back to the concept of everybody needs to benefit, and that we need to minimize or eliminate and address and recognize the harm that's been done. And so we're working actively with many partners on a battery circular economy initiative. Essentially, if we are borrowing minerals from the Earth's crust from future generations, we have to ensure that the new system is planned to be circular and to be inclusive, and that we acknowledge and remedy where possible the harm that's been done to extract them thus far. The second is really around that ensuring that we reach the communities who can benefit the most from low-cost, zero-pollution mobility. And I loved the three tenets that you laid out. The premise that one of our guiding premises recently that we actually learned working with a community-based organization is the term beneficiary-led design of solutions. And so while we can be facilitators in the process, we can be enablers, we can be good listeners, really we are there to help frame and bring sort of unspoken for or non-preconceived notions about the distribution of those resources, but to where possible make them available, and then really to rely on the beneficiary-led design. That will be the most resilient. It will be the most durable solution for sure, and we're already seeing that show up in the work. So. And
before we move on to Carol, real quick, what does circular economy mean?
Oh, it's the idea that we can repurpose and reintroduce all of the minerals, metals, and other components for a second life, a third life, a fourth life, completely unlike the old automotive system, which was sort of falsely built on an idea that we can endlessly extract crude oil out of the ground. The new one needs to be built. It is our responsibility to ensure that it is built in such a way that a gram of cobalt or of lithium that is put into a battery today is still in a new battery that our great-grandchildren are benefiting from.
That's perfect. And Carol, what does it mean to you? What does just transition mean?
You know, it's interesting because this is not an area in which I work, but this idea of just transition, when you think about education opportunities in the United States and even beyond, we're educating young people from a very young age, and that's sometimes the only opportunities they have. in order to be able to advance their understanding about how the world is changing. And so want students to get to a certain age, not whether again they live in the United States or beyond, oftentimes by the time they turn 13, they no longer, for some of them, have choices around the kind of education opportunities that they're given. So in a world in which we're making a just transition to example, a green economy, we don't want to leave anyone behind. And so when people are ages 5 to 13, that is the opportunity for them to better understand the incredible innovation that's happening in the world that allows them to live in a more sustainable future. And so for me, a just transition, while the field of just transition does not necessarily talk about education, it has to. And so we know that if we want to make a difference for young people who care deeply about the future of their world, we have to give them the opportunities while they're in formal school systems to better understand what does it take to live in a more sustainable world? What choices can I make as a young person to make more sustainable choices? And to me, that conversation around what's happening in education has to be infused into the conversation around just transition.
And just one thing I meant to ask you about that I forgot real quick. I listened to some, researching for this session, I listened to some of the podcasts you're in, and you talked about inclusivity also, about people who have disabilities or other things, and the importance of that. Can you touch on that real quick?
Yeah, so we have a program called Zero Barriers in STEM Education. And oftentimes when you hear about the work around diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion, justice, belonging, every one of those terms means something different, and yet each one of them is crucial when looked at collectively. So you can diversify, for example, the STEM workforce, right, by making sure that the STEM workforce represents our population, for example, in the United States, and it doesn't. You can do that, but still not provide equitable opportunities or ensure that all people are at the table. That means you're not being inclusive. And you may not also provide opportunities to people along the human ability continuum. So each one of us on this stage, we have different physical abilities. They might not be visible. We also may have different neurological disabilities or differences, and they may not also be visible. But what we do as educators is make certain that we are applying universal design for learning so that all students, no matter their human ability, have access to content. And so I know in terms of many industries are designing new, say for example, transportation of the future to make certain that no matter what your ability, every one of us could get in a car and be able to move around the city, whether we have certain physical abilities or not. And so universal design for learning is the same. Make certain that all students in our educational systems have access to content and physical experiences in science and can get out to their communities to study sustainability topics, no matter what their human ability is. So that's what Zero Barriers is for us.
Okay, great. And Mustafa, I kind of feel like I've gotten the sense from you, the answer to this, but I'm curious to hear what you're going to add.
Well, some of y'all I know here in the room, so one side of my family I was raised by Baptist and Pentecostal ministers, so if you hear some of this response, you'll understand what's going on. When I think about a just transition, it is really about being in balance, because we are out of balance in the moment. It is about the first principle of environmental justice that talks about honoring Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, right? It is about no one getting left behind. When we talk about a just transition, we're talking about the former coal workers in Appalachia who now are going to be looking for new sets of opportunities to be able to do quality work and to be able to take care of their families. We're talking about the folks in the former Rust Belt being able to move into a new space and be able to move forward in a very positive way. It is about making sure that the impacts, those public health impacts that happened both in the past and in this moment, that we're moving away from them. It is about this new set of opportunities that are in front of us. But the best way for me to illuminate what this just transition should look like is I'll ask you to do me a favor. Look to the person to your left. If your neighbor doesn't know their left, help them out. Look to the person to your right. By now, you should have looked both ways. Reach your left hand out to the person on your left-hand side. And reach your right hand out to the person on your right-hand side. Take their hand if you have the ability to do that. I know for some folks that can be a
I have hand sanitizer if you need it afterwards.
There it is. I want you to think about something. If everybody can take that person's hand and stand, this will help you to better understand the just transition.
I love that. Now we need to do it, guys. Okay,
Yeah.
come on.
So the just transition is about us re-engaging in our humanity. It is about us, as my sister said, making sure that no one gets left behind. It is about embracing a new set of opportunities and making sure that equity and justice is infused in those. It is about us addressing the climate crisis, but it is also about us addressing the imbalances that happen in relationship to wealth in our country. It is about finding new opportunities that no one should have to have their life shortened from pollution. A just transition is about a new tomorrow. It is about a new tomorrow that includes both corporate and nonprofits and frontline organizations. It is about honoring the voices and the intuition and the innovation that young people bring into this space. That's what a just transition is about. When you really unpack it, that means that the folks who give misinformation and place false labels on things because they don't want to see progress happen, they don't want to see equity happen, we change that dynamic because look at the person to your left. Look at the person to your right. They might have a different skin color. They might come from a different socioeconomic background.
Have different abilities.
They might have different abilities. Thank you, my sister. But the one thing that we all want is to be able to live and to live in a sustainable fashion and to be able to move forward in a direction where everyone is uplifted. That's what a just transition is about. And if we do that, we change the dynamic.
Well, I can't end it any better way than that way. I think that is just fantastic. There's no better way to end it, and I'm trying not to be verklempt here. So thank you so much to our guests. I think we got some really great insights, and thank you for participating in this. I know it's a crazy week, so I think we did a pretty good job for next to last day of the week. Thank you, everyone.